these drones are penetrating the most heavily guarded, or what's supposed to be the most heavily guarded airspace in Russia, right around Moscow. You have had drones fly over areas where the Russian elites live, near the Kremlin. This is pretty extraordinary. But then on the other hand, if you think back to the beginning of the war, of how atrociously the Russians performed, well, perhaps it's not that big of a surprise. And when we think a few weeks back on when the late head of the Wagner Group, Mr. Pregosian, how close he got to Moscow, it makes you wonder how well prepared or well defended they are.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are talking to a global affairs analyst with more than 2 decades experience in humanitarian work and international journalism. Michael Bociurkiw is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and has been a spokesperson for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He's also an author and a regular commentator for many international media outlets. Michael, welcome to Frontline. Thank you so much for your time. You're speaking to us from Johannesburg, where the BRICS summit has just been held, which brought together Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. What is your takeaway from that summit?
Good to be with you, Kate. Well, what a head spinner it was. We all came here to South Africa with very low expectations, but in fact, the bloc of nations who, fair to say, feel very marginalized from the rest of the world, the ones you mentioned, have expanded, more than doubled their membership. Interesting choices. Argentina is now a member of the club. On the African continent, we have Egypt as well as Ethiopia, which is a bit of a surprise. We have someone from the bloc of nations which are one of the most sanctioned in the world, Iran. And then on the money side, or cash-rich side, we have Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Now, there is no mistake about it, Kate. China is really in the driver's seat on this one. You could see it everywhere, from the swagger of Xi Jinping the moment he got off his airplane to the cash he was throwing around to the South Africans, who, by the way, are suffering from horrendous power blackouts. I was talking to a group of ambassadors yesterday in Johannesburg. Everyone pretty much agrees that it's China beating the drum here. They're the ones that wanted expansion. Why? Because I don't want to say they want global hegemony, but they do need a lot of energy. They want to get a lot more countries, I think, addicted onto their Belt and Road Initiative. And the fear there, too, is that countries like South Africa, who take aid from China, will end up in debt traps. And one more quick thing, of course, Russia is the other big member. It was very odd to see Lavrov here. As you know, Putin didn't show up. He was afraid to get arrested on that ICC warrant. And even though they were here, even though China was here, a few others, Lula from Brazil was really pushing peace. 2 things did not move forward whatsoever, in my estimation. One was a peace agreement for Ukraine, and then the other was reopening of those shipping lanes across the Black Sea that brings grain to places like Africa.
As you suggested, a disparate group of countries that have been invited to join. Is there anything they have in common, do you think?
Well, I would say a majority of them have a lot in common, and that is their authoritarian regimes. They have very low regard for human rights. And it's really China and Russia who are throwing their might around in the world, whether it's the South China Sea or whether it's in Ukraine and in the region at the moment. But, in fairness to the bloc, because of course we can't put Brazil in that category, nor South Africa, but throughout the many speeches, there were 60 leaders here altogether. We heard a lot about the imbalance in trade, how this rules-based international system isn't working out for the smaller guys. There's talk of creating a BRICS currency. Really, they feel like the West is almost against them, and they want to level out the playing field. So we'll see how that goes. I have to say I'm very supportive, for example, of African nations trading more with each other. Only 18% of trade here on the continent is between countries. And the big reason for that is they're all using different currencies. So if, for example, Kenya can trade with Djibouti in their own currencies, that would be very helpful for them. They avoid a third currency like the US dollar.
Did you see this new grouping of alliances as a threat to the West or not?
Well, as I wrote in my opinion piece, I think if the West does not pay more attention to their grievances, especially the United States, then they will drift off, and we're going to be headed into a kind of multipolar world or bipolar world. In fact, the UN Secretary General was here, and he said in no uncertain terms, Kate, he said, we're headed towards a scenario where we'll have a lot of chaos in the world if we have different blocs not agreeing with each other. The other thing, which was interesting to watch, is they actually did come out with a statement at the end of the summit, something that we're not seeing that often anymore at G7s or G20s. Even if they do issue communiques at the end, they're watered down or they don't come out at all. So this is a bloc, by the way, that operates on unanimity like the OSCE. So if every country has a veto, and for example, if there's further expansion to be happening, it requires that everyone be on board.
And Michael, you are, of course, of Ukrainian heritage. And when Russia launched its offensive against Ukraine in 2022, you gave up your privileged life in Canada to put yourself to go back to the homeland of your parents. Can you explain the focus of your work since then in terms of Ukraine?
Yeah, well, I came a month before the full-scale invasion happened. A few months before that, Putin issued his rambling 5,000-word so-called essay about what Russia means and what Ukraine means to Russia. And it was exactly then that I knew that he was going to make a move. And don't forget, we also had that several weeks of buildup of Russian equipment and forces in Belarus and elsewhere around Ukraine. So all the kind of smoke signals were there that an invasion was going to happen. And I decided I needed to come back to Ukraine. I've spent a lot of time there for the OSCE and other organizations because I really wanted to give a kind of insider perspective of what's happening. Not necessarily reporting from the front line, but really the nuances of daily life, what's happening beneath the surface, for example, to the Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, the mass exit of people from Ukraine and what that means in the bigger scheme of things. In the earlier weeks of the war, I was based in Lviv in Western Ukraine, but then I moved down to Odessa on purpose. I've been there more than a year now because it is closer to the front line. It's there on the Black Sea. It's the anchor of that Black Sea Grain Initiative. And it was, for the most part, a Russian-speaking city. But now what has happened indirectly, and again, these are the things that I noticed because I'm there and I speak Ukrainian fluently, is that a lot of people have dropped Russian as their language of communication and now switched to Ukrainian. You see Ukrainian flags everywhere. There's patriotism. So this is something that Mr. Putin has done indirectly, is that he's really fired up that Ukrainian nationalism that was a little bit dormant in some parts of Ukraine. The other ironic thing, of course, is at the beginning of the war, Putin said that Russia is coming in to defend Russian speakers. Well, it so happens that a lot of the cities that have been bombed relentlessly, Kharkiv in the north, Odessa, a lot of cities along the current front line are Russian speaking. So at the beginning, if you wanted me to draw a type of timeline, there was a lot of fear. I mean, this was an awful, awful attack on Ukraine. Many civilians killed, middle of the night rocket attacks, drone attacks. But that turned to anger. And I think that's what you're seeing now, this kind of irrepressible resilience, whether it comes to Ukrainian troops on the front line or operators of small businesses, of which I have many friends working in that sector, is they're saying we're going to continue life as normal because we want to show the Russians that they cannot beat us. So it's really uplifting to see. And those are the types of things I'm recording and putting forward.
So you've seen a move from fear to anger, have you, since you first went back there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, Kate, you're also seeing a reverse migration of people coming back. A lot of people in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, Ukrainians who went there, are having a tough time making a go of it because of the cost of living crisis, things like that. The other thing I'm hearing from them, I travel on the bus a lot between Moldova and Ukraine, is they miss home. They want to be on their homeland. They want to help defend the country. And, they're doing this for especially mothers and children, a very scary environment. For example, in Odessa, we have up to 6 air raid sirens a day. A lot of them are at night. You don't know for sure whether it's going to be a hypersonic rocket, a cruise missile, a drone attack. So you have to take precautions. And the other thing it's done is it caused a lot of disruption to daily businesses because they have to go into bomb shelters or they have to close down. Education has really been impacted as well.
Since you've been in South Africa, Kyiv has announced its forces have officially liberated the southern frontline settlement of Robotyne, a significant gain as troops tried to advance south to cut off the land route between occupied Crimea and Donetsk. Is there a sense that the momentum is gradually starting to pick up in the counteroffensive?
I think so. At the beginning of the counteroffensive, I've said, do not, expect a shock and awe type of counteroffensive. This is something that's going to take quite some time. A couple of reasons for that is, number one is the Ukrainians want to use the advantage of surprise to attack the Russians. They need to probe where the weaknesses are along the front line. And the other thing that's, of course, attributed to the slowness is the Russians have had time to dig those deep trenches up to 10 kilometers in some parts of minefields, of Dragon's Teeth, those things that stop tanks. So in the time it took the West to really grow the spine to deliver more muscle to Ukraine, that gave the Russians time to dig in. So, but the Ukrainians are doing an incredible job with what they have. And this kind of advance they made in the past 48 hours or so is really, really critical because their aim, it appears to us, is to cut off that land bridge between mainland Russia and Crimea, huge resupply route, get access to the Ukrainian ports that were occupied. And then we're also seeing still action around Bakhmut. It appears that Ukraine has gained about 40 square kilometers there. One more quick thing, and I think this is really important for people to know. It isn't only the front line where the fighting is happening or the struggle is happening, so to speak. It's on that other front as well. All over Ukraine when Russia launches these missiles and drones. And then we have a third front line opening up now as well. Ukraine shooting drones or rockets into Russian territory, something which was a no-go area because the West feared escalation. And that, Kate, is bringing the war directly to the doorsteps of ordinary Russians, something that must concern Mr. Putin.
What do Ukrainians talk to you about when they reflect on those drone attacks inside Russia itself?
They're pretty proud. I mean, Telegram and other Ukrainian channels light up with celebration. There are a lot of cartoons and memes, and this is their way of saying, "Now you know how we feel. Now we know of the fear. You can taste it." And I think this is also incredible because these drones are penetrating the most heavily guarded, or what's supposed to be the most heavily guarded airspace in Russia, right around Moscow. You have had drones fly over areas where the Russian elites live, near the Kremlin. This is pretty extraordinary. But then on the other hand, if you think back to the beginning of the war of how atrociously the Russians performed, well, perhaps it's not that big of a surprise. And when we think a few weeks back on when the late head of the Wagner Group, Mr. Pregosian, how close he got to Moscow, it makes you wonder how well prepared or well defended they are.
With your interest in human rights, have you been able to get a perspective on what has been committed in Ukraine and who's been committing war crimes against humanity?
Sure. It's not only looking, in person, but also talking to many friends and contacts who are really deeply involved in documenting the war crimes. I've used this phrase many, many times now, is that as soon as we think we've seen the basement of Russian inhumanity, they surprise us and they go even further in terms of their shocking brutality. So, for example, not that long ago, Odessa was badly struck in the middle of the night. A rocket capable of destroying warships flew right into the main Orthodox cathedral in Odessa. Another one went directly in the heart of the historic district. And along that, of course, death and injury. I remember, Kate, an early visit I did to Chernihiv in the northern part of Ukraine, and just looking, down into one of those huge missile craters that came from a 500-pound Russian missile. It's hard to talk about when I think about it, but the shredded teddy bears and the end of childhood lives that happened when this came down, and this has been repeated almost on a daily basis throughout Ukraine. These rockets, by the way, travel so fast, but Ukrainian air defenses are getting better. But there are those that do get through, and imagine you're sleeping and a big explosion in your building. It's really, really horrible. So yes, we're trying to bring that on a daily basis to the world to give the war a human face, because to a certain extent, the war is very high tech with the drones and everything else, hybrid warfare, but enormous human cost.
And if we just go back to that news of the retaking of Robotyne, it follows this meeting, it's reported, of senior NATO military chiefs and Ukraine's top general on resetting Ukraine's military strategy. Ukraine may not have the numbers that Russia has, but how far does that NATO guidance, training and support go in actually compensating for that and giving Ukraine the upper hand ultimately?
I would suspect pretty far. The key here is you have military equipment from all over the place flowing into Ukraine, and all of this needs to be coordinated. Strategies need to be coordinated. Supply chains. I'll give you a very quick example. A lot of bridges, for example, in Ukraine are not designed to handle the weight of these modern Abrams tanks. So things like that need to be thought of. When the F-16s come to Ukraine, going to be enormous supply lines that have to come in. This is an aircraft with tens of thousands of different spare parts. So there's a lot to be done, but I think the way NATO looks at it, this is also an investment in the security of the NATO bloc, because Ukraine is that kind of buffer between Russia and NATO's eastern flank. But I think they could go a lot further. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in that meeting. And what I mean by that is, Ukrainian grain is meant to be flowing to many, many countries around the world as we speak. It is not. It's completely stopped. And the Ukrainian Navy has actually unilaterally declared safe sea passages across the Black Sea. They're not in a position to defend them by themselves. But if NATO were to come and give surveillance from the air, as well as armed escorts to these ships, because again, this is a key kind of component of the global food supply chain. By declaring war on Ukraine's agricultural sector, Mr. Putin, it should be seen that Mr. Putin has also declared war on all of us, because here at the BRICS conference, I was talking, for example, to visitors from Egypt, and they're saying, yeah, they're feeling it. Bread prices, a staple there, of course, is going up. So wide-ranging effects. We cannot stand for this type of behavior.
Interesting, you actually put on your website that the investigative journalism group Bellingcat reports that Russia is taking even greater care to avoid sanctions, turning off its transponders so it can use its ships to export grain from eastern Ukraine via Crimea to Iran. So how far are those sanctions against Russia actually going?
Well, it's frustrating because I think what happened, Kate, during the COVID pandemic is Russia had a lot of time to inoculate itself from Western sanctions. And who taught them? Guess who? The Chinese. While all of us were in lockdowns at home, feeling sorry for ourselves, Chinese diplomats were racking up frequent flyer miles going to Russia and giving that type of knowledge. So they know how to sanction bust. I'm sure they're learning from the Iranians as well. So what needs to happen is the noose needs to be tightened even further. But we have nations that are friendly to Russia, for example, Turkey, many of the Gulf states that are welcoming Russian tourists, Russian investment. They're not too keen to extend these sanctions to the oligarchs who park their yachts in places like that. So that's a big problem. Having said that, I think you do have people like Mr. Erdogan of Turkey, who does have Putin on speed dial, can call him up and say, "Hey, maybe you've gone a little bit too far on this and that." I think people like leaders like him, maybe Saudi Arabia can perform another miracle on the diplomatic scene and get Putin to, you know, look at this more sensibly and stop the war. Because again, it's no longer a conflict just between Moscow and Kiev. It's a conflict that, through the weaponization of food and energy and migration, is with the Western rules-based civilized world.
If we could just talk briefly about this dramatic development, the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin from the Wagner Group. The Russian military command have made efforts to purge and suppress insubordination, according to the Institute for the Study of War, within its ranks in Ukraine. How great is the danger of the killing of Prigozhin that it might trigger a new series of insubordinations?
Well, I think that it remains to be seen. Look, first of all, this let's call it for what it was. This was a public execution in the sky, as number one. Secondly, there is no room for two huge egos in the bubble which Mr. Putin and Mr. Pregosian occupied. What happened is perhaps the Russians thought Pregosian will disappear, go off and dig potatoes in Belarus, or drive tractors, or go extract more blood diamonds in Africa. But instead, he started jetting, between Belarus and Russia and within Russia, and that's what finally got him. I'm really shocked that he had his deputy and a lot of his top command on the same airplane. That seemed as real carelessness. But to answer your question, I do think that the Pregosian people overestimated the amount of support they have, either within the Russian military or Russian public opinion. Putin and his circle have worked very, very hard to instill a sense of fear among all sectors of Russian society. So anyone from Navalny on down has really been silenced or threatened. Journalists have been threatened. A lot of foreign correspondents kicked out. So I think they have the lid on pretty tightly there. So I think Putin probably feels pretty smug right now that he's eliminated most opposition.
And how likely do you think it is that Wagner fighters can be absorbed into the regular Russian Ministry of Defense, pledging their allegiance as has been demanded?
I suspect that this might be happening with a gun pointed to their heads, that you either be absorbed, you take commands from military leaders, or you end up 6 feet under or in a Russian prison where some of the other people who have come to the Ukrainian front line have come from. So they're not going to have much opportunity to run away from this. I think there'll be either a big purge or a big effort to absorb them. The other interesting thing, we don't know what's going to happen to the billions of dollars that come out of the ground here in Africa through the efforts of Wagner. What's going to happen to those lucrative contracts that Wagner had with African dictators or reprobates who relied on their services to stay in power. So I don't think that's something the Russians are prepared to take over overnight, because that was a huge effort and Wagner had deep roots here.
In your role as a former spokesperson for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, I was just wondering what lessons you think can be learned from the war in Ukraine and the kind of new alliances it seems to be creating.
Oh, that's probably an answer I could talk about for hours, but I think a couple of things there off the top of my head, given, of course, my humanitarian background. After all the conflicts we've had in the world, it's still shocking to see how ill-prepared the West is, or institutions like the UNICEFs and World Food Programs, UNHCRs of the world, to absorb these huge refugee flows, because we all know by now that when a conflict happens, it doesn't take long for it to ripple around the world. The other thing is that we're still very early days in terms of documenting the other kind of invisible destruction to culture, for example, to all the churches, museums, things like that. It took a long while to get the Ukrainians prepared to protect a lot of their priceless cultural artifacts from Russian aggression. So things like that are a bit surprising. And of course, all of us are surprised that in this day and age on the doorstep of Europe, we have such a conflict going on. But the one main thought I'll leave you with on this one is that we can't underestimate the kind of thirst that people like Mr. Putin have for territorial expansion. I firmly believe, Kate, that if Russia were to able to dominate and get control of Ukraine, that it will not stop there. It will go further. In Putin's twisted mind, the only Russia that is the proper Russia in his mind is one that absorbs most of the former Soviet states. And that's a pretty scary thought, considering how far a lot of the countries, the Polands and the Hungaries and other countries around there have succeeded in the past years.
Is that what most Ukrainians you speak to in Ukraine say to you as well? Do they believe the same as you do?
Absolutely. That this is someone with that huge thirst, doesn't care at all for human life, will do what it takes to get that territorial expansion done. And, we can't forget as well that they also have their other nefarious means from election meddling. We have an important one coming up next year in the United States, of course, and also the misinformation. I mean, I'm gobsmacked, Kate, being here for the past few days on the African continent to seeing the deep penetration of Russia fake news and media entities. To give you an example, the Ukrainian embassy in Pretoria has, I think, 3 or 4 accredited diplomats. That is it. That compares to 100 plus for the Russians here. So, and I can tell you that they're not all Boy Scout diplomats. A lot of them are doing stuff to either undermine democracy or to spread disinformation. One more quick thing, and I should have known this going in here, is that there's still quite a bit of support for Russia here. Going back to the ANC days when the former Soviet Union gave cash and training to the ANC. So people remember that, and there's still a soft spot there for them here.
I'm just wondering, on a personal note, Michael, when you're heading back to Ukraine, what you'll be working on, and also, is that it now? You're going to live in Ukraine for the rest of your life? Is that your plan for the future?
That's a good question. Well, when people ask me that, I say, well, a lot of it depends on Mr. Putin's plans and how far he plans to prosecute this war. But I've actually wanted, for the longest time, to broaden the aperture, so to speak. I want to travel a bit more through Europe and talk to those Ukrainian refugees who are struggling. I also want to document, as I'm doing right now here on the African continent, what the Russians are up to. Because, a lot of what they do here or elsewhere around the world does at the end of the day affect, for example, voting in the UN General Assembly and fora like that. But I have to say the Ukrainians, whether it's in Kyiv or Lviv or Odessa, have been extremely hospitable. I've really feel like I'm almost an honorary citizen of Odessa. They're always there for you in the depths of it when strikes happen. Even if they have to defend themselves, they will make sure that you're okay too. So amazing, amazing people. And, there's a bit of fatigue going on with the war, as you know. Newsroom budgets are being cut, less people coming through. I do like to feel that I'm, for as long as I can be those kind of trained ears and eyes on the ground telling the world what's happening.
Honorary citizen of Odessa, Michael Bociurkiw, it's been great talking to you, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.